Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 13th of September 2024. This is going to be a military aid and assistance video. And I'm going to start with a real bugbear of mine, something that really irritates me. And there are a lot of people that should know better and some people that don't know better. And for both cases, we need to make sure that we are correcting people when they make these claims. So I was arguing with someone that used to contribute to me in a previous kind of blog that I used to run, critical thinker, at least he used to be, and has gone down this rabbit hole where he's now absolutely deep in an ecosystem that is kind of totally MAGA. It's actually he's now broadly openly racist, etc., etc. Anyway. He was repeating to me the claim that the US should not give any more aid to Ukraine because we've given X hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine and Europe has not given anything and they need to be doing more. And basically he regurgitated almost word for word what Donald Trump said in his debate against Kamala Harris the other night. And this is either misinformation or disinformation, but it's functionally the same. And actually, if Trump is repeating stuff that is wrong, but he doesn't know it's wrong, but he doesn't care whether it's wrong or not. He doesn't do the due diligence and check up on facts because it is functionally useful for him to give those claims out to the wider world, to his electorate. Then that's almost as bad, if not equally as bad, as knowing that they're false and giving it out to the electorate. It's like, I can't be bothered to check whether they might well be false, don't really care because I just want my electorate to think X because I want Y. Or I'm going to lie so that my audience think X so that they do Y. This is dangerous and we need to change people's idea of what's going on. So just to remind you, quite often when the US is giving equipment to Ukraine, it is giving obsolete or old equipment. Not all the time, but often obsolete and old equipment that has a book value. But it's not like they're giving money, like getting cash out the cash machine and just throwing that at Zelensky. They're giving a bunch of equipment, taking it to Ukraine, and then not all the time, but sometimes replacing that equipment. Depends whether it's just sat in a warehouse and it's kind of like not really doing anything functional for the US, apart from being like an emergency if they need. I mean, they've got like, say, 6,000 Bradleys or whatever it is. It's like, okay, give a few hundred of them. That's not going to affect the strategic reserves of those vehicles for the US. And they've been bought and paid for. So it's just like, right, give them to Ukraine and then maybe replace them with the newer stuff. So the money is often a way of upgrading the US armed forces rather than giving stuff to Ukraine. So you're upgrading your own stuff. You're also, or armed forces, you're also economically stimulating different regions wherever these manufacturing facilities are. So you might be giving contracts out to X, Y, and Z through USAI. So sometimes you are either building stuff to replace what you have given away, or you are ordering stuff for Ukraine directly, and that is stimulating certain economies that brings in new tax dollars and jobs and etc., etc. And quite often as well, when you are putting those orders in and they're getting sent to Ukraine, like HIMARS missiles, the rest of the world is looking at that, seeing it being used, say, right, we want some of them. And so HIMARS is now, it's like a marketing for the US economy. So now the world is saying, yeah, we want HIMARS. They've got a big backlog because everyone wants these because they've seen them work in Ukraine, etc., etc., etc. So when you talk about however much money you're talking about, so say the $61 billion package, actually only about $25 billion worth of that package was military aid to Ukraine. And even that gets split down into Presidential Drawdown Authority, USAI, which is ordering, and FMF and military sales, and all sorts of different stuff different ways of helping out Ukraine. But is not only is it strategically helping the US, they're not giving that. It's no such thing as a free lunch in this context. All of this money is money that the US is investing in achieving their strategic objectives for the world, right? This is not a free lunch. So one, it's about return on investment strategically and geopolitically. Two, it's about economic investment. Three, it's about national security investment, so on and so forth and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's all of that. And then there's the headline numbers, which is, okay, given all of that, how much aid have you given, however you add it up. And there might be some arguments about how the US add up its aid and how other countries might add up its aid, up their aid, and there might not be apples to apples. Okay, there could be a slight incongruence in the way that these figures are derived. However, the figures are pretty much the opposite to what Trump was saying. So let's go to Steve Ratner, who does a bit of fact checking here.
Let's move on. Donald Trump making false claims about oil production in America as well as spending on Ukraine. Let's listen.
I got the oil business going like nobody has ever done before. When they took over, they got rid of it. We're in for 250 billion or more because they don't ask Europe, which is a much bigger beneficiary to getting this thing done than we are.
What you said before?
They're in for $150 billion less because Biden and you don't have the courage to ask Europe.
False.
Steve,
all of that false.
Truth on these two.
Okay, he doesn't talk about oil, but just, I know this is not to do with this video, but that graph on the left is, so Trump, when he was president, was a net importer of oil. He's an importer of oil. And it's only since the Biden administration took over, they become an exporter. In other words, Trump's wrong about the oil claim as well, but we're going to talk about defense.
He got his numbers almost exactly reversed. It's quite remarkable. At least he had some numbers in his head. They just
not just wrong numbers, though, entirely wrong, like opposite wrong.
For the wrong ones for the wrong thing. So the fact is that Europe has been far more generous to Ukraine as we have been, over $180 billion to Ukraine. We are limping, I shouldn't say limping along because it's a reasonable amount of money. We are sending $100 billion. And, this whole little flatline piece here, you remember the whole fight last spring about whether to give them money at all. And it barely got done at all. And so we are by far the laggards in who's contributing more to the Ukraine problem.
All right, Morning Joe economic analyst, as always, breaking it.
So it's just wrong. They're either lies or it's completely irresponsible to spread unchecked misinformation. And then today, just as a kind of example, Finland announced the 25th military aid package for Ukraine valued at 118 million euros. That puts up their total aid given to 2.3 billion euros. Remember, Finland, compared to the US in terms of population and GDP, is a minnow. And so that's really substantial, especially as they're actually giving some of their most highly prized, I guess, technological stuff that is at least very new technologically speaking, as we discussed yesterday. So that's really good from Finland. Now, they don't announce what they give, so we don't know what would be entailed in that package. But I just wanted to put that one in as an example of Europe giving stuff. And we'll talk later about what Lithuania, Latvia. We talked this week about what Sweden, UK. There's so many European nations. Okay, UK not in the EU, but you get the point, right? Because remember, actually, if we go back to this figure, I think this is an EU figure, right? If you add because of course Trump said Europe, right? So geographically, he didn't say the EU, and he doesn't argue it's the EU's issue. He argues about Europe. Well, actually, you add UK onto that, and you get substantially more. So that's worth considering as well. Okay. This isn't about, we've given more than you. America done an amazing job in terms of the stuff they've given, the amount they've given. I'm not belittling that. I'm correcting someone's erroneous facts that is trying to demonize Europe and try and claim Trump is trying to claim that it is all about the US and the US has done everything. Without the US, Ukraine would be screwed. I'm not denying that. They've done a great job, but we must be fair and accurate in what we are claiming. Right, we're going to go back now to the rumbling old issue that is possibly going to be sorted out today as Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, is visiting Joe Biden in the US. And I can tell you, because I've listened to the radio today on the way to the dentist, and I've seen the headlines and whatnot, this is being like Ukraine is back on the news agenda. We have discussion about storm shadows all over the UK news sites. Okay, Joe Biden is close to allowing Ukraine to use long-range Western weapons against Russian targets, says no reports, as long as weapons do not come from the US, according to European officials, as reported in New York Times. This issue is set to be discussed during British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's visit to Washington, with Britain already willing to let Ukraine use its Storm Shadow missiles, pending Biden's approval, to ensure coordinated support with the US and France. Okay, so there's that. Britain and the US are not planning to give Ukraine permission to use weapons to penetrate deep into the Russian Federation at a meeting at the White House today, says ITV in an interview with Keir Starmer. So there's a bit of, I don't quite understand what's going on, because people are reporting this in two completely opposite ways. Mykola Bielyskov says Putin decided to play a trump card with the latest comments that US, UK and France this coming decision to greenlight ATACMS and Storm Shadow employment against the Russian military targets in Russia proper might mean that now NATO countries are part of Russia-Ukraine war with all consequences. Would this blackmail work now? So we're going to come to what Putin is saying in a wee while, because it's super important to see whether this is typical rhetoric, it's just bluster. I guess we won't know until it happens, whether there is any genuine answer from Russia. But one thing that is clear from this quote, and I don't know if this is from New York Times or whatever, but the idea here is, let's read the whole lot. The key national security officials argued was that the Ukrainians were the only ones making the final decision about whether, where and when to shoot. Americans, the White House and the Pentagon lawyers said, could collaborate on devising Ukrainian military strategy, arm Ukraine soldiers and tell them generally where the enemy would be and when they would be there, all while avoiding becoming a co-combatant in the conflict. So this is all about the legality, what the Biden administration are doing. And you can argue, you can slag them off for this, or you can say they're actually doing their due diligence here, is that they want to be providing assistance to Ukraine without being legally seen, in terms of international and military law, legally seen to be co-combatants in this war, so that they cannot be rightfully accused by Russia of being involved in the war. Like, this is a war against NATO, against the US. So that in order to justify Russia directly attacking the US, right? So it's important that you do get this right. And that's possibly why we have such a cautious approach from Biden and his administration. It's all about the legalities here. The end quote here is, it was a finely tuned legal distinction, but one very important to Biden, Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken, who had to make the case that the US was aiding Ukraine, but not fighting Russia. So it is important to understand at least why the US might be so reluctant to be so forward with their provision and allowance for the use of weaponry and assistance. Okay, so Ukraine may receive permission from the US to strike Russia with British Storm Shadow and Scout missiles, according to the Times. However, the country will not allow its ATACMS to be launched, hoping to prevent further escalation of the conflict. Right, if this happens today, so we could have a situation where the US goes, okay, we are now going to give Ukraine permission to use Storm Shadow and Scout. So these are the UK and French cruise missiles, air-launched cruise missiles. You can use them deep into Russia, because before we understand that the UK had given permission for Ukraine to use those missiles some time back. Keir Starmer, literally days after he is elected Prime Minister, met with Zelensky and said, right, you can use them. And then some days later, MD said, actually, they're not really allowed to use them, not from our point of view, but from the US. The US is not letting Ukraine use Western weapons because it doesn't want escalation. And so the US was kind of blackmailing Ukraine by saying, if you're fine, you can use those Storm Shadows. Go on, use them if you want. But if you do, we, the US, will not continue to provide you with assistance. So you had this tension between all these nations, with some nations saying, you're fine using our stuff, and then the US saying, you can't use their stuff. We're saying you can't use their stuff. Now you might get the situation, and I can sort of understand this as well, where they're going to say you can use UK and French missiles, and then the Ukrainians might start using them, and it's not the Americans that get in trouble. So if there is escalation, it's a British fault. Now, I'm cool with that, like, as a British person, because I quite like the idea of creeping to a point whereby There is no one, like if the US said, right, you can use anything you want, wherever you want, that gives Russia, now this has been discussed in public, which is itself an issue, should never have happened. This should have just been done. No one talked about it and it just happened. But now so much in public, if the US say, yeah, do anything you want, then Russia could come back and say, right, that's escalatory and now we're going to do nukes or whatever it is. Whereas if you go, okay, you can't use American ATACMS, but you can use British Storm Shadows. Is that quite enough for Russia to go nuts about? Is that enough to get over the nuke red line? Probably not. So that's quite clever. And then it could be like some weeks later, well, they're already using Storm Shadows and Scalps, so now you can use ATACMS. And then all you are now talking about is this much of an extra capability as opposed to this much. So right now, if they were allowed to use everything, this is where they're at. They're allowed to use everything. It's going this far. And that distance is too much, arguably. It might be too much for Putin to cope with. But if you say, okay, Storm Shadows and Scalp, then you've got here, and that's not quite enough. That's not enough for Putin to get nuts about. And then next time you say, now you do this, that's not quite enough either for Putin to get nuts about. And in the end, you've gone that whole distance, but you've done it in 2 steps, which is each individual step is not enough to trigger the red line issue. So I'm cool with allowing Scalp and Storm Shadow initially, as long as ATACMS eventually get allowed. That's possibly quite sensible. Now, Fabian Hoffman says, if Biden remains too panicked, this might be a useful intermediate step. Exactly what I was saying there. Have the British take the lead again before following up, because remember, we did that with the tanks as well. It was the Challenger 2 that arguably unlocked the ability for Abrams and then Leopard 2s to be given to Ukraine. As Colby Badwar says, it's maddening, but if this is what it takes for the US to come to its senses, so be it. So I would disagree with it's absolutely maddening. I think, which is what Colby Badwar says, I think there is a sense to this that can be made of that situation. Jay in Kiev says, the only reason Biden will authorize Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles before his election is because they don't have any. So one of the issues for Ukraine is that they get given permission to use Storm Shadows and Scalp EGs, but there are none left in the inventory. Max24 has previously said Ukraine has relatively few Storm Shadow missiles left after using many of them to fight Russia in Crimea. It also has supplies of ATACMS missiles which have a similar range, but is not currently allowed to use them outside its own territory. So we have seen definitely far fewer Storm Shadow missiles used. At least we're not hearing about them. And Storm Shadows are not being produced, nor a Taurus, but they're not using them. And Scalp EG, I think, are either being produced at very low levels or they're kind of in stasis at the moment. What the French are doing, by all accounts, is trying to go around the world and get Scalp EGs off nations that have bought them previously. They might be replacing them with something newer, or might just be up for selling them back, or whatever the situation is. But I think the French are trying to do that in order to get hold of Scalp EGs to give to Ukraine. So, yeah, it's one thing allowing these missiles to be used. It's another thing making sure Ukraine has enough of them to be used. Hopefully that gives you some further clarity on something that has absolutely no clarity at the moment. Right. Anton Gerashchenko says Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation has announced its decision to revoke the accreditation of 6 British diplomats in Moscow, whose actions allegedly bear signs of, quote, intelligence and subversion. So basically, you got 6 British diplomats in Moscow who have been exiled, not been allowed to continue their work, being sent back home. Is this coincidental, or are we seeing an initial reaction to the permission of the UK to, that permission being given to Ukraine to use UK missiles deep inside Russia? I think this is an initial political reaction there. In addition, the FSB said that Russia would demand that other British diplomats leave the country early if similar actions are detected. Arguably trumped up charges, although when you have diplomats working in these countries like Russia, Russian diplomats are nothing short of spies. So anyway, we're now going to go to what Putin has said in direct answer to this issue of ATACMS, Storm Shadow missiles, NATO, US, UK, France, etc., etc. So I'll read you the subtitles here. The question is about making a decision on whether NATO countries, says Putin, will be directly involved in a military conflict or not. And involved, obviously, this is me talking, involved is a suitably vague enough term there. So we talked earlier about how the US is trying to make sure they're not a co-combatant in the war. And he uses the term involved, which kind of would cover co-combatant, but also he says directly involved. You know, at what point is direct involvement? You know, when you've got NATO countries and NATO supplying money, arms, ammunition, training, intelligence, then what part of that is not direct involvement? Is direct involvement only having human beings from your country operating militarily inside Ukraine? And I think, again, there's just an awful lot of vagueness there. Anyway, to go back to what Putin was saying. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing less than the direct involvement of NATO countries, the US, the European countries in the war in Ukraine, which is wholly bizarre. So he's making a false distinction. He's saying at the moment there's no direct involvement, and if the US allows these weapons to be shot far further, then that is direct involvement. So hang on, you can use HIMARS 84 kilometers into Russian territory, and that is not direct involvement. But as soon as a missile goes over 84 kilometers, it is direct involvement. So ATACMS being used to go 300 kilometers is now direct involvement, but HIMARS going 84 kilometers is not direct involvement. That tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and artillery being used in Kursk inside Russia by Ukrainian forces is not direct involvement. But a missile being shot an arbitrary length into Russia is direct involvement. Of course, this is nonsense and doesn't stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny, but that doesn't matter for Putin. His job now is to scare the US into not changing restrictions. Anyway, he continues by saying the following ... This is their direct involvement, and this, of course, fundamentally changes the very essence, the very nature of the conflict. Now, this is demonstrably incorrect for the reasons I've just given you. It changes nothing. All you're doing is allowing Ukraine to fire a little bit further than they previously were. Or maybe a bit further, or maybe quite a bit further. But this is a matter of, is not fundamentally changing the very essence at all. Like, it's not a category shift, it's a scale shift. 84 kilometers has now become 300 kilometers. Okay, that's not changing the very essence. Had those air bases been within 84 kilometers of the front line, they would have been hit already. There have been other air defenses and facilities and ammunition dumps and depots that have been hit. All you're doing is saying these ones are just a little further away and now going to be hit. It's not a fundamental change. So he's just demonstrably wrong there. He continues, this will mean that NATO countries, the US and European countries are at war with Russia. So this is where it starts getting quite serious, because if we're going to take him seriously on this, then essentially, if the US changes its stance with regard to these weapons, this is a declaration of war. That's the implication here. This will mean that NATO countries, the US and European countries, are at war with Russia. Now, it's not him declaring war, but he's saying that they will have effectively declared war. So that's then giving a permission structure for Russia to do, well, I guess, whatever. The point is, it keeps you guessing, and being afraid of nukes, you don't change the restrictions. He finishes off by saying, and if this is the case, considering the change of the very nature of this conflict, we will make corresponding decisions based on the threats that will be created for us. Now, as you'd expect from him, this is suitably vague. And this is pretty much the same rhetoric that he has given at every other red line that he has presented for Ukraine and the West. So if you're going on form, This horse his horse has not started every single race, right? It hasn't come out of the stalls. So he says, right, if this happens, we're going to win the race. And then the starting gun goes and his horse doesn't start. Okay, if this happens, we're going to win the next race. And then it doesn't start again. So on form, we should have confidence that he will do nothing as a result of the lifting of restrictions, and that this is equally bluster as it was before. But of course, when you're talking about nuclear war as being on the line here, you want to make sure of that. You want to make sure that actually when the starting gun goes, that his horse actually doesn't fly out the stalls and win the race. You want to make sure he's not going to fire nukes. And of course, you can't know that. You're always second guessing. So this is why people are overly cautious, because we're talking about nukes. We're talking about mutually assured destruction, possibly. Right, a group of our pilots is already undergoing F-16 training in Romania, says Rustem Umerov, the defense minister for Ukraine. So they have their pilots being trained on F-16s in Romania. In addition, the Romanian partners will soon send a Patriot air defense system as well. So that's been given the go-ahead, the green light by the Romanians. The Netherlands has handed over to Ukraine the previously promised MPQ-53 radar for the Patriot system. So they've got parts of, I think it's probably more than that, they've got parts of a Patriot system. They were hoping other nations would come together with the Netherlands and provide an entire battery, but no one actually came up with the goods. So the Dutch are like, okay, we've got these bits, you can add them to your existing batteries. That looks to be what's happening. Sadly, not a full battery was able to be generated there. Now, Lithuania plans to purchase short-range air defense systems for Ukraine, according to President Gitanas Nausėda. He stated that Lithuania is exploring the possibility of acquiring these systems for Ukraine's air defense and hopes that to have a positive result within 2 to 3 weeks to transfer them to Ukraine as soon as possible. So that's really good news. I don't know whether we're talking about, say, manpads, or whether we're talking about more substantial air defense systems, such as some tracked-based or wheeled chassis system, whatever. Lithuania has sent another batch of M113 personnel, armoured personnel carriers and off-road vehicles to Ukraine, according to the country's MOD. The delivery is expected to arrive in Ukraine this week. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Lithuania has provided military aid to Ukraine worth over 679 million euros. And obviously a very small country like that, that's a pretty meaningful, certainly for them. Now, military aid to Ukraine has been updated, according to Jeff 2146, with an unknown number of combat vehicle reconnaissance tracked armoured personnel carriers. So we're talking Latvia here. There have been the claims that Latvia are going to be given these Patria systems, but he's saying here the size of the donation is stated as company-sized. Vehicle type is most likely FV-103 Spartan. So this is UK previously used by, or an older UK system vehicle called the Spartan, which the Ukrainians already have a number of. They could be going from Latvia. I don't know if that's as well as the Patria armoured personnel carriers. According to Gazeta Wyborcza, Poland is reportedly the only country that has yet to provide funds for the Czech initiative to purchase artillery shells for Ukraine, despite its promise of support. In contrast, Germany has contributed the most to the initiative. So Germany often gets a bit of the sharp end of the stick, and a bit of a raw deal when it comes to how people interpret aid being given to Ukraine, but actually they've come up with the goods an awful lot there. But Poland, interestingly, the only ones who haven't stumped up the cash for the Czech initiative. Now, the Euromaidan press reports that a Ukrainian company, Rovatech, has designed the Zhmy, which is a UGV, an unmanned ground vehicle representing a leap toward an affordable and efficient mine clearance technology. So this is what it looks like, supposedly, and that the chains will go over and try and generate an explode, or try and trigger an explosion in the mines. If that doesn't work, then the heaviness of those big old wheels going over will probably trigger it. And fairly sizable, but actually fairly small bit of kit hopefully means it's quite fixable, quite robust as well. and that can go about doing its business mine clearing. There are so many different mine clearing options, it appears, and that's great because, my goodness, there are a lot of mines in Ukraine. Now, good news in terms of ammunition. These are for like the AK-47 and 74 or AK-74 family of rifles. Ukraine has reportedly managed to restart production of the 5.45 and 39 times 39mm ammunition. A picture surfaced on About Weapons Telegram channel showing several boxes of Ukrainian-made shells at a training range with markings suggesting they were produced in June of this year. So that's really good news for the Ukrainians there. Producing their own ammunition is going to really, really help. A Russian mine layer drone, on the other hand, is here, and this looks like a pretty useful drone, right? It's battery powered, 20 kilowatt UGV, and it can reach a maximum speed of 10 kilometers an hour and move on slopes of up to 25 degrees. It can operate for 4 hours. Communication equipment allows the operator to control the device at a distance of up to 1,000 meters. Optionally, and by using fiber optic cable, the distance between the operator and the drone can be significantly increased. The mass of the Impulse KPTM is 1,350 kilograms. It can operate to temperatures from minus 25 to 40 degrees Celsius. All specs, as reported by the Russians, it may differ in reality. So that's what they claim. But actually, something like this would be super useful. A mine laying UGV is certainly worth considering. Now, most of the ones we've seen previously have those mines loaded on kind of a flatbed and then dropped off as they slope the flatbed down and tip it back, and then the mines come off. Sometimes you see mines attached to not a string, but I presume some kind of cable, and you can pull a string of mines along and have them laid all in a long line, and they can actually, I think, probably detonate in a line as well. Okay, I digress. This fascinating. So what we have seen is the Russians receiving a new batch, supposedly, of Su-57 fifth generation fighter jets. These are your top dog stealth fighter jets that the Russians have. They've only minimally used in this war, possibly because, one, they don't have that many of them and they're super expensive. Two, they're not actually that good. Three, they don't have the pilots to fly them. Any one of those could be the case, or for they're untested and they don't want to test them. What's the point of having them? They want to test them in an actual war zone. So these are the Su-57. So they've received a new batch of these. Interesting, because this is at a time where they're at war. They're unable to produce all the things they want to at the scales they want to, and yet they produce some Su-57s here. This picture has interested people the most, though, because of that area of the Su-57 there and this area over here. And we'll talk about this now. So just to show you what they look like there. So that was some pictures from the Dead District, who says above, we don't need flush mount. He's taking the mickey out the Russians here, like scare quotes. This is not actually what they said, but this is what they sort of think. We don't need flush mounted rivets for our 5th generation stealth fighter, said the Sukhoi executive as he built a 3rd vacation house on the Black Sea. Remember, this is a stealth fighter that's supposed to be la creme de la creme of the Russian fighter fleet. Look at this. It looks like it's been made by some year 5 kid in DT classes in primary school. Like, what is going on there? Fascinating stuff. And there are another bunch of pictures as well. This is OSINT Technical, showing that on the wing. Just, I'm sure that's not what you should see on a stealth fighter that is costing an arm and a leg. Just absolutely incredible. And this is great. I'm fairly certain this panel saw hand finishing, full stop, with a mallet, full stop. Yeah, that is not what you'd expect from a Su-57, supposed to be, competing with the best planes in the world, if not itself the best plane in the world, if you're Russian. Daniela from Tochny, who I've interviewed a number of times, said, I had luck to work during my master's degree in a lab which developed RAM for military applications from IR mitigation, so that's intelligence reconnaissance mitigation, or is that infrared mitigation, to high frequency absorption. By only studying some books, you can understand how stealth technology is a direct measure of your understanding of physics and engineering. Looking at what the Russian MOD shows to the world with confidence, calling it a 5th generation stealth fighter, makes me laugh. Several people covered this, even in research papers, but it is surprising how many see this as a show of strength, continuous development, and a display of readiness. Rivets are only part of the issues. The dual engine is exposed. So talking about these rivets and other pictures that I've just shown you. The dual engine is exposed with a metallic thermal cover which shows signs of temperature changes, so likely easy for a man-pad to lock on. Intakes with minimal, if not absent, mitigation of blade or microwave interaction, increasing the RCS by a scale factor comparable with most of the 4th generation fighters. I don't really know what that means, but you get the point that it's not good. The point that I want to make is how much Russia relies on the pure bluff and how much Western countries fall for Russia equals the USSR. And they did this during the USSR, remember, as well. So they bluffed about how many nuclear weapons they had. And it only came out later that they didn't have nearly as many. Didn't have nearly as many nuclear weapons as the US thought they had, and that caused the US to react in certain ways. Russia seemed to get by with deception time after time after time. This war has shown it, and yet we're still at a point where we're afraid of Russia. If this is the condition of new aircraft, if the Navy is in such a bad state, if the Army is a shadow of what it should be on paper, what could be the readiness state of a way more complex system like a thermonuclear warhead that needs maintenance over a decade? If the US has issues in keeping up training for its ICBM crew, intercontinental ballistic missile crew, so your nuclear missile crew, how Russia can do better after having shown its limited capabilities in preparing its own soldiers for land warfare? Question mark. You know, a really good point. Like, we don't want to dismiss the Russians. They do have nuclear weapons and etc., etc. And I was talking about caution earlier. But on the other hand, you're looking at this going, you guys are a bit crap. Added to which, the Voice of America reports that Russia repairs its Su-30s with Western equipment. Now, we've heard of this. I haven't reported the last couple of days, but there's been talk about how French company Thales and some others have been providing equipment to Kazakhstan, I think. I don't know if it's directly, but French equipment and other Western equipment has been used in Kazakhstan to upgrade or to maintain Sukhoi jets. I don't know whether that's Russian jets being taken to Kazakhstan to do that. Anyway, recent investigation uncovered complex international scheme, so that's going to be Kazakhstan, allowing Russia to maintain its Su-30 SM fighter jets using French equipment, potentially undermining the effectiveness of sanctions. Now, this is where you would hope that Kazakhstan gets a real rap on the knuckles, if it is indeed the country in question here. So, according to Anton Pavlushko, an analyst at Inform Napalm, so these are a Ukrainian, I think, sort of hacktivist group that find out lots of information and put it in the public sphere. The scheme involves a Kazakh company called ARC Group, acting as an intermediary between Russian defense entities and French manufacturers Thales and Safran. So that's it, Safran. Quote, Russians have decided to gradually abandon foreign parts and replace them with their own. However, it's not that simple. Some parts still remain. Anyway, this is worrying, and I hope something happens about that. Finally, and this is exactly what I said over the last week, exactly what I've said. Sometimes I get like the imposter syndrome where like, really, do I know what I'm talking about? And I make these speculations and think, well, who am I to say these things? And then they end up being true. And I'm like, oh, it turns out I'm not as stupid as I look. So Russia has begun producing a new long-range kamikaze drone called Garpia A1 with a max range of 1,500 kilometers. Production started in 2023, and the drones are equipped with, who knew, Chinese engines. So I was saying the only way I can see that the Russians are able to fire this many Shahed drones or one-way attack drones into Ukraine on a consecutive nightly, consistent basis. Okay, last night was 26 drones, and that was or 28 drones. That was the lowest we've seen for some time. It's usually like 40 something or more at the moment every single night. And we haven't seen that for a long time, if ever, in terms of that kind of consistency. And I don't think they're getting them from Iran, so I think they're building them themselves. We know they've started up indigenous manufacturing facilities, but surely they're getting stuff. We've been hearing that China is helping out more and more. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the Chinese are going to be helping out with drone manufacture. And what do we hear? Production started in 2023 and the drones are equipped with Chinese engines. Reportedly, over 2,500 of these drones have already been manufactured. Holy crap. 2,500, 50 drones a night you can do at, 50 days? 50 days of 50 a night. And that's kind of what we're seeing at the moment. So this is a massive worry, I think. And China needs to be... there needs to be action taken against China for such activity. Anyway, that's enough from me. Hopefully that was useful. I know it's a bit longer than it would normally be due to some sort of discussion elements. Sorry, not sorry. Take care. Speak soon.